Hello YouTube, I'm Toby. Now today I have yet one more computer build. This time it's sort of a mid-range PC. The reason I built this system is, well, I had a few spare parts laying around and I managed to get a bunch of good parts from a friend at a very good price. So now right here you see all the parts of the system. The processor itself is an Intel i3 7600. It's a quad-core processor with 4 threads and it's clocked at 3.5 GHz. Now this CPU resides in a mini ITX motherboard made by MSI. Anyway, this motherboard has 2 DIMM slots for RAM. We have a reinforced PCIe Express lane, which is kinda nice, and it's also the full-sized slot. One of my favorite things about this motherboard has to be the fact that it's got built-in Wi-Fi. I only have one stick of 8GB DDR4 RAM for the system. It's clocked at 2666 MHz, and the graphics card in the system is the NVIDIA GTX 1050. This is the 2GB version. I believe it's GDDR5. Power supply is a Corsair 550 watt power supply. It is semi-modular, and I'm kind of worried about these long motherboard and CPU power cables, but we'll have to deal with that later. Now the SSD that's in here is a Kingfast 120GB SSD, and we've also got an old 2.5-inch hard disk drive that's got a whole terabyte on it. So finally we have the computer case. One thing about this case is that the previous owner kind of modified the front of it to fit a AIO water cooler, and this kind of gives me an issue with my hard drive. Now the first part of this build went quite smooth. It's pretty much just easy putting this CPU cooler on. Now when I fit the motherboard with the CPU cooler attached to it into the motherboard, I started getting a little bit nervous about the height of the CPU cooler. Now when I have pretty much everything fitted in here, you can kind of see the way I went about the SSD and a hard disk drive mount. And I haven't had any issues mounting it this way. It just kind of looks really stupid. But ultimately I managed to complete the build, and I'm actually at this point very happy about it. It works fine and it looks pretty decent. When I first went ahead and turned on the system, I realized my first mistake. I don't know if the motherboard manual or I had screwed up, but I switched the reset and the power button. I'll have to go in and figure out that one later though. But that's enough talking about the computer. Let's jump into some benchmarks. First up, we have Cinebench R15, and we ended with a score of 631. Furthermore, I decided to run the OpenGL test, and we ended with a score of 120 frames per second, which is pretty decent, I would have to say. Next up, as I always do, I ran the Resident Evil 6 benchmarking tool. This time I set the settings to high, and it was set to 1080p. We ended with a score of 10,066 points. And I wrote in my notes that there may be some very minute stuttering. I really can't pinpoint these exact places, but I just kind of felt it as I watched the benchmark running, that sometimes it seemed like it was stuttering a little bit. Next up, I fired up Counter-Strike Global Offensive on high, also 1080p. I was seeing somewhere around 180 to 190 frames per second. Sometimes it went over 200, sometimes it went down to around 140, but never below that. And I wrote in my notes that it was a very smooth experience, so yay from me. Next up, I launched Subnautica, set the settings to high, and we're once again running 1080p. Now I've written in my notes I was seeing somewhere between 50 and 80 frames per second, and I also wrote smooth. If I have to be quite honest, I actually thought there would be a better frame rate in Subnautica than 50 to 80, but I'll take what I can get. Next up, I decided to run PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Set the settings to medium, and once again running 1080p. We're seeing a frame rate somewhere between 60 and 70 frames per second. A few dips under, a few spikes over, but generally between 60 and 70. Now I did decide I wanted to throw something a little bit harder at it, so I tried to launch Arma 3. This did not go as planned, however. First off, I got a system resource warning. First off, I thought maybe my RAM had, maybe I didn't have enough RAM in the system, but After I exited that message, the computer crashed with the memory management error. I thought this was kind of weird, and I actually tried again, but the next time I got the IRQL not less or equal or something. I really can't remember what exactly the error was, but I fear it might have something to do with the memory, since I had a slight suspicion this RAM stick may not be as good. I remember using it in another project and it kind of behaved weird, but here it seems to behave weird as well. But I did decide to run the Windows memory test tool, and after I did that, the computer pretty much just crashed and said it needed repairs. So that's pretty much where this video ends. A success until it failed, pretty much. Now my final words on this system is that I have pretty much 4 things I need to do about this system. I need some new RAM, and I'm glad I have that 16GB kit coming in. I was wanting some more lights in the system, since the green doesn't really do much for it. Furthermore, I need to fix the start and reset button. And finally, I want to take another look at my cable management in there. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching.